welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. And today I'm going to be telling you about atomic islands and the geography of island nations being nuclear testing sites. Because in the world there are entire islands that are being erased for science and geopolitical power. In the mid-20th century, the world tested its most terrifying weapon. Not in laboratories, but in real land with real people. In the Marshall Islands, in French Polynesia, and in the Arctic. These were the atomic islands, where the future of warfare and empire collide with fragile ecosystems and human lives. Why remote lands were chosen? Nuclear testing is not just a matter of physics. The geography of nuclear testing is obviously very important. Scientists and military planners saw isolated, sparsely populated islands with access to the sea and a controlled airspace. This includes coral atolls, volcanic archipelagos, and frozen Arctic islands that offer isolation, minimal local interference, and strategic positioning for observation. On the Marshall Islands, for example, Bikini and Enitawan became the testing grounds for the United States under Operation Crossroads in 1946. In French Polynesia, Marua and Fangatuafa atolls became the testing ground for France between 1966 and 1986. Novaya Zemlya was the Soviet Union's Arctic archipelago, hosted dozens of different tests, including the infamous Tsar bomber, the largest bomb ever detonated. These islands were frontiers on the literal sense, peripheral on a map, central to Cold War calculations. Their location was not neutral. It reflects the reach of empires, logic of secrecy, and the calculus of political risk. The choice of test sites was inseparable from empire. Many of these islands were colonial or semi-colonial territories, meaning governments could legally regulate local populations. The US tested on the Bikini Atoll, part of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, under American administration. Across the Bikini Atoll, the French Polynesian territories, and in the Arctic, in each case the geography of the empire allowed control without accountability. These islands' remoteness made monitoring easy, resistance harder, and visibility from the world's media minimal. The logic was clear: if you wanted to explode a bomb, you couldn't do it in the touch of the eyes of critics, or worse, the hands of the affected population. People living in these islands, the nuclear testing was catastrophic. Governments would often evacuate populations under the promise of temporary safety. In practice, displacement became permanent. In the Bikini Atoll in 1946, about 167 inhabitants were relocated to Rongerik Atoll. The land there was infertile, and food shortages caused long-term malnutrition. Many were never allowed to return to their ancestral home. Across Mururoa and Fangatofa, local Polynesians were moved to Tahiti and other islands, facing overcrowding and a threat to traditional livelihoods. In the Arctic, indigenous Nenets communities were relocated inland, and the reindeer herding economy was disrupted. Displacement was more than physical. Cultural and spiritual geographies were erased. Burial grounds, sacred sites, and traditional villages vanished beneath concrete bunkers and testing sites. Oral traditions recall the trauma. Elders speak of seeing the sea turn strange colours, fish dying in lagoons, and strange fallout across the islands. Beyond the immediate displacement, nuclear testing reshaped social structures and their economies. Fishing, coconut farming, and local trade were disrupted. Traditional lives were replaced with aid dependency, and subsidies from colonial powers like the US aid often failed to match the scale of the loss. There were also health consequences from radiation exposure, causing thyroid disorders, cancer, and birth defects. In the Bikini Islands, several generations were affected. Children born after testing carry the very visible scars of this fallout, and also social fragmentation. The evacuations scattered families, fractured communities, and disrupted oral cultural transmission. Some islanders were forced to integrate into communities, foreign societies, where they faced discrimination and neglect. The atomic islands became places where the human cost of global power was concentrated far from the capital of decision-making. The irony was the most powerful nations on the earth caused the most harm on the smallest communities. These islands then became laboratories. The tests themselves permanently altered landscapes. On the Bikini Atoll, coral reefs remain partially destroyed. Even decades later, plutonium contamination keeps large parts of the island uninhabitable. In Mururoa, tests cracked atoll surfaces, causing landslides and radioactive seepage. Local fish stocks were poisoned, along with the local marine ecology. The Arctic tundra bears the scars. Villages are abandoned, leaving a ghostly geography of military action. Nature became both the tool and the victim. The islands served as a controlled terrain for scientific experiments, whilst the oceans carried the consequences outward, spreading the fallout to hundreds of kilometres away. And these were also geopolitical tools. For example, the US used the Bikini Islands and Enitawan to demonstrate nuclear dominance during the Cold War. Each blast was intended to send a message to the Soviet Union. France used French Polynesia to maintain its post-colonial prestige, assuring that Europe could still wield as a global power. And the Soviet Union used the Arctic to showcase the sheer magnitude of their weapons. The maps of these atomic testing sites show that remote islands, not cities, bear the brunt of the destruction. The human geography of this vulnerability is stark. Power projects outwards, whilst the comfort and the control remains within the capital. The atomic islands remain a haunting legacy. Bikini is now largely inhabitable, though it is occasionally visited by tourists and scientists. Oral histories and museums preserve the history of the people that were displaced. Mururoa partially returned to Polynesian oversight, but residual contamination and political tension linger. The story of atomic islands are paradoxical. They were laboratories of progress, where humanity advanced in physics, engineering, and militaristic ambitions. They were laboratories of power, where governments tested the limits of authority, sovereignty, and ethics. And they were also laboratories of human endurance, where communities survived, resisted, and preserved culture despite the displacement, contamination, and neglect. The Pacific, once seen as a distant periphery, became a stage where Cold War anxieties played out over coral reefs. The Arctic, equally remote, remains its northern counterpart. And that's it for today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed this look. If you liked it, give us a like and subscribe for more. I bring out new episodes every Tuesday. All right, goodbye.